So, where are the Galapagos Islands? Well, the Galapagos Islands used to be called the Enchanted Islands because they were hard to find. Even when you're sailing from one island to another that you can see, it is possible for the ship to go off course because of the strong currents. The ancient mariners thought that the islands possibly moved all by themselves, and there is some truth to that. The currents there are unpredictable and strong. The first official discovery of the Galapagos was by the Panamanian bishop Fray Tomas de Berlanga. He was not necessarily the first person to be there. The Incas have a myth that they were there earlier, but there's no evidence to support that. The bishop was on his way to Peru when his ship was becalmed, and it drifted off course. They were in desperate need of water and grass for horses that they were carrying at the time. They reached the Galapagos, but they had a great deal of difficulty finding fresh water, and there was plenty of salt water. 2 of the crew members died before they found fresh water, and 10 of the horses were lost. The bishop wrote a letter to King Charles I of Spain, and in the letter he noted the very tame tortoises and birds. But other than that, the land was considered to be entirely a waste. The Galapagos Islands themselves are about 600 miles to the west of Ecuador, and they consist of about 100 rocks and islands. There are 13 main islands, and the oldest of them is about 5 million years old. They're created by a hotspot to the west, and that hotspot is very similar to the hotspot that's at the Yellowstone, or for that matter, Hawaii. As with Hawaii, the hotspot, a thin spot in the Earth's mantle that allows lava to come up from the Earth's core, creates those islands. The youngest of the islands is Fernandina. Fernandina is the youngest of the islands, only about 45,000 years old, and there have been about 30 eruptions in the last 2 centuries. As the Earth's crust moves, it carries the islands southeast from the hotspot an inch or 2 a year. The big island is Isabella, about 700,000 years old. It erupts still occasionally, but there's enough earth available that's been created out of the lava for grazing tortoises. As we move steadily to the east, we arrive at Santa Cruz. There, the volcanoes are entirely dormant, and the island has its own forests, making it a fairly lush location for lots of different animals. The further to the east we go, the less volcanic the terrain, and the more earth has been created over the period of time as the islands are worn down slowly. The result of that is that as you go east, the islands tend to become much more lush, much more capable of supporting life. Effectively, the islands are on a giant conveyor belt, drifting to the east away from the hot spot. By the time you reach 3-million-year-old Hispaniola, the island is flat. And as it drifts to the east, the islands are worn down more and more. Further still to the east, the islands are submerged, and this process has been going on for about 30 million years. 90% of the plants and animals on the Galapagos are unique to those islands, and 95% of the plants and animals that were there when humans first arrived are still there. We are flying into Baltra, a small island just north of Santa Cruz. It used to be an Army Air Corps base. It was there in order to defend the Panama Canal Zone before World War II. The Army Air Corps abandoned it, and it is now a commercial airport. The Galapagos Islands each have 2 sets of names. One set of name is in English, and the other one is in Spanish. This is because in the early days, the Galapagos Islands were controlled by the English, and of course they became Spanish and then Ecuadorian. The most famous visitor to the Galapagos, of course, was Charles Darwin. He arrived there on the 15th of September, 1835, and at the time he was only 26 years old, and really he was just out of undergraduate school. He had just gotten his degree. He arrived on a ship, a British naval ship called the Beagle. It was doing surveying, and it had been in South American waters for the past 3 years. The Beagle's captain on this voyage was Robert Fitzroy, himself something of a naturalist. Fitzroy had been made the captain of the HMS Beagle on its first voyage.
Fitzroy was an officer on the HMS Beagle when the captain, presumably lonely and depressed on a very long voyage, shot himself in the head. While this was good for Fitzroy, he was made the captain, it troubled him because his family had a history of some mental instability and of similar ends. His uncle, the Viscount Castlereagh, had slit his own throat not long before. So before undertaking his first real long voyage as captain, he decided to invite a passenger, a gentleman's companion. Of course, he just couldn't fraternise with anybody. The person he chose, his second choice, by the way, was Darwin, an amateur botanist, and reassuringly, a man of the cloth, a man trained in religion.
Fitzroy was descended from royalty. The Fitz implies that he was illegitimate and the Roy of a king, and in fact he was descended from Charles II. As a result, he was politically well connected. The Beagle was a Cherokee-class 10-gun brig sloop of the Royal Navy, but her guns were reduced from 10 cannons to 6 when she was becoming a survey vessel, and there was a mizzen mast that was added to improve her maneuverability, thereby changing her from a brig to a bark. Captain Fitzroy was a wealthy man, and at his own expense, before the second voyage, he had the Beagle completely refitted. He had the upper deck raised as much as a foot, and Cherokee-class ships had the reputation of being coffin brigs. That is, they handled badly and were prone to sinking. By raising the deck, he gave the Beagle better handling and made her less liable to be top-heavy and capsize. And it also helped the decks to drain more quickly so that less water would be collected in the gunnels. Fitzroy took on board 22 brand new chronometers, and he employed the son of a watchmaker just to maintain them. He brought on board a new lightning conductor and 5 new barometers of a just patented type. The second voyage of the Beagle was the one commanded by Captain Fitzroy for the entire period of time, and this is the one where he brought Darwin along with him. They spent a total of about 3 years surveying the area around South America. That was the area that was of primary interest to the Royal Navy, especially the area around Tierra del Fuego. After leaving South America, they went to the Galapagos for 5 weeks, then on to Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, and on around the world until they got back to England. Now, to find his traveling companion, Fitzroy sent to a friend in Cambridge, and that friend recommended Charles Darwin. The problem, of course, was that Charles Darwin had no educational background as a naturalist. He was not a zoologist or a botanist. He was trained as clergy. He was to be a vicar. But Darwin honed his skills in South America for 3 years before coming to the Galapagos. In comparison, he was only in the Galapagos for about 5 weeks. But it's the Galapagos period for which he is most famous. The entire trip took 5 years. Now, can you think of any other voyage that was to last 5 years?
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Gene Roddenberry patterned the Star Trek episodes on an earlier science fiction work called The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which itself was based on the Voyage of the Beagle. Therefore, one would assume that that makes Spock playing the part of Darwin.
Fascinating.
This also explains why a beagle is the captain's pet in Star Trek Enterprise.
Where is the vault? Do you understand me?
I can't lock onto its language.
Our voyage starts at Baltra, where the old Army Air Force Base was located. There we're going to jump on a ship called the Mary Ann. She's a barkentine, a little bit different from the Beagle's configuration.
John, I've given you the technical readout for the Mary Ann, and I've got the technical readout for the HMS Beagle. And what I want to do is I want to compare and contrast the two ships. Now, first of all, the HMS Beagle was launched in 1820. When was the Mary Ann launched?
It was launched in 1997, Craig.
Well, the next thing I'm looking at is the rig. The Beagle started out as a brig sloop, and what that means is it had two masts. It had square sails on the forward mast, and then on the main mast it had square sails down to a point, and then it had a spanker in the back. Now, for its second voyage, the one that Charles Darwin is on, the captain of the ship had the Beagle refitted, and it was changed from a brig sloop into a bark. And what that means is it had three masts this time. The forward mast, again, has square sails on it. The main mast this time has square sails all the way down, and then the mizzen mast has that fore and aft sail in the back. How is the Mary Ann rigged?
Well, interestingly enough, it's known as a barkentine, and it also has three masts, the first of which has square sails, the forward one, and the following mast have fore and aft sails. So somewhat similar, but not quite the same, obviously.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the size of the ship. I've got the Beagle down here as having a length of 90 feet. How big is the Mary Ann?
It's 119 feet, so it's actually a little longer.
Well, it's pretty close, though. There's not that much difference
Nope.
between the two of them. And the beam I've got is 24 and a half feet for the Beagle.
Well, the beam on this ship is almost 26. It's 25.9.
So it's almost identical on the beam. Okay. And the draft I've got on the Beagle is 12 and a half feet.
Well, it could sail in much shallower waters then, because the draft on the Mary Ann is 16.7 feet.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, the ship's complement, the number of people that were on the ship, and this is for the second voyage of the Beagle, when it had been turned into a survey ship. Now, if it had been a man of war, it could have had as many as 120 people on it. But as a survey ship, its crew was only 65, plus it had 9 extra people for, as they referred to as supernumeraries. What's the crew capacity of the Mary Ann?
Much smaller, Craig. There's actually only 8 crew on this ship. But of course, they're not working the sails as often as the crew on your ship would have been.
Well, of course, that's true, because after all, the Mary Ann is motorized.
Yes, it is.
Okay. One other thing, when the Beagle was a ship of war, it had a complement of 10 cannons. But when it became a survey ship, it was reduced to 6 cannons. So how many cannons does the Mary Ann have?
Not a one, Craig. Not a single one.
Well, that's terrible. But even at that, the Beagle's bark was worse than its bite.
I knew that was coming, and you still got me.
We're going to the Western Islands now, the islands directly over the hot spot. On these islands, the lava has been flowing fairly recently, and as a result, any terrestrial-based animals that washed up on these shores would find life tough going. The largest island is here in the west. Its name is Isabella, or Albemarle. It's over 4,500 square kilometers and constitutes over half of all the land area of the Galapagos Islands. Isabella is composed of 5 volcanoes, and of course the ground is mostly lava. The result is that terrestrial animals generally have a hard time making a living in these western islands. One final note about the volcanoes. These volcanoes do not tend to explode the way you expect volcanoes to do. Instead, they tend to ooze lava. These volcanoes are not the tall stratovolcanoes, but rather these kind of volcanoes are called shield volcanoes. They tend to release their lava much more slowly over a longer period of time and do considerably less damage as a result. Shield volcanoes are called that because they tend to produce mounds which look like a shield setting on the ground, as opposed to a steeper mountain. But with that said, how does life take hold on the Galapagos? What do they eat? How do they make a living? Most animals don't depend entirely on the land. There are 5 currents that come into the Galapagos. Probably the most important current is the Humboldt Current. It comes out of the south, and the Cromwell Current coming out of the west. Those are both cold water currents. Cold water holds more oxygen and therefore more life, and the result is good feeding for those animals that depend on those currents. Cold water currents predominate during half of the year, and the other half of the year the warm water currents like the Panama Current predominate. We arrived as the currents are shifting from the warm water to the cold water currents.
Bathymetric studies, examining the depths of the ocean using sonar tracks, give the archipelago a whole new dimension. Galapagos is a chain of submarine volcanoes that have coalesced into a vast underwater platform. This monumental plinth drastically changes the routing of the currents that sweep its flanks. It forces the cool Cromwell Current, heading in from the west, to surge up from the ocean floor.
Now it's easy to see how the fishes got here. They just followed the food in the currents, and they ended up in the Galapagos at the end of the Humboldt Current and some of the others. These little fishes happen to have found a friendly place in the shadow of the Marianne, and they seem to be enjoying themselves. But any time that there are little fishes around, there are big fishes not far behind them. All of a sudden, the little fish disappeared, and I looked to see where the big fish was and what it was. And on the other side of the ship, I saw a ray. Actually, several of them. Rays are related to sharks, but they tend to be thin as pancakes and have wings so that they fly through the water more than anything else. Here we see a constellation of 15 golden rays. One of the most impressive marine encounters in the Galapagos is with the Pacific manta ray, the largest of the rays. Specimens of this fish have reached wingspans of more than 20 feet, and with their flattened body shape, they glide along like underwater birds. Manta rays, sometimes called devil rays or devilfish, are filter feeders, gulping down large amounts of water into their mouths with the help of special appendices in both sides of their heads. These extensions give them their alternate name, the devil ray. Once they have a mouthful of water and plankton, they spit the water back out and eat the plankton. One interesting feature of mantas is their color pattern. Mantas are most commonly black above and white below, but some are blue on their backs. Individual mantas possess distinct dorsal and ventral coloration that is unique to each animal. It's believed that the markings on their shoulders and ventral side show distinctive regional differences. The size and shape of the shoulder patches, the precise form of spots and blotches on the ventral side, and the lifetime pattern of scars form a pattern of markings as unique as a human fingerprint. This next little fish is a puffer fish. It blows itself up to expand its size when it's threatened. And it's good eating if you're Japanese and you know how to prepare them, of course, because they are poisonous. And if you make an error in the preparation, it could be a fatal error. Of course, the fish aren't the only thing that just came in with the current. There are a series of crabs that also came in. The first one that you're going to see is the Sally Lightfoot crab. It's a very pretty crab, and you can see that it would have no trouble making a living on a volcanic island. Because it lives between the land and the sea, that means that it can pick up food that's either washed ashore or algae that starts growing on the lava rocks. No problem here for them. The Sally Lightfoot crab is omnivorous, and like its name suggests, it is light-footed. It's very agile and can get around quite well. They are very common in the Galapagos and throughout most of the Americas and even in Africa. These next crabs are ghost crabs. They're very rapid, and those little stalks at the top of their head, those are their eye stalks. They're very difficult to catch, and when they feel threatened, they go down a hole. Finally, we have the hermit crab. The hermit crab is a soft-shelled crab, and it's very vulnerable. And so it looks for someone else's shell, which has been discarded, and it adopts that shell and carries it around with it, thus carrying its protection right on its own back. As the crab grows, it needs to look for larger and larger shells to crawl into. Now here's something you don't expect to see on the equator. It's a penguin. And the penguins are related to the penguins that you find in Antarctica. They followed the Humboldt Current north along the South American coast until they got to the Galapagos, which is where the Humboldt Current ends. They make a living here, but I can't imagine that they're terribly happy. As you can see, they don't quite so much swim through the water as they fly through the water. And this is something I really didn't expect. It's a penguin floating on the surface of the water as if he were a duck or something. I have never seen this kind of behavior before. Of course, there are lots of other birds that made it to these islands. They flew there, of course, and one of the most common types are diving birds of one type or another, such as pelicans. And when they go into action, you can see how they make their living without any difficulty. They swoop down into the water, go into the water, and scoop up a certain amount of fish. Now this is a fine diving bird that flew into the Galapagos to get the fish, but now, today, he can't fly out. This is a flightless cormorant, and as you can see, his wings are very small. They're about the third the size that he needs in order to fly, and his body is very big. And part of the reason for that is because his legs have become very strong so that they can paddle him along in the water. Since there were no predators on the islands, the cormorant didn't need to be able to fly. And now it can. Every day we have to weigh anchor and take off to a new location and see new sights. And we're traveling up along the western coast of Isabela, or Albemarle, and we're headed down the other side. One thing to keep in mind is that all of these islands are volcanic. I know I've mentioned that before, but one of the things that it means is that there are likely to be lava tubes almost everywhere throughout any of the islands. Now this particular lava tube that we're going down into is actually on the island of Santa Cruz, which in the English language would be indefatigable. However, this particular lava tube is extremely large, and it's been opened up for tourists. And the result is it's got incandescent lighting on the inside of it. But as you can see, it's an extremely large tube. Nevertheless, tubes similar to this, sometimes quite close to the surface, can be found on virtually any of the islands. And if you're not careful about where you're walking, it's possible that you could step onto a thin spot in the crust of the lava and crash through into one of these lava tubes underneath. Now these tunnels often extend all the way out into the ocean, and that means that ocean water is going to fill them up and be brought into the center of the island pretty often. And sometimes that water is actually visible on the surface in the form of little pools or lagoons. And that's one of the things that frustrated Bishop Thomas de Berlinga. When they found water, often it was brackish water, not the sort of water that they wanted to drink, not the sort of water that they needed. But there is another creature that needs this sort of water, and that's the flamingo. And it happens that, in fact, the Galapagos does have a colony of flamingos. Now these flamingos are genetically related to the ones in the Caribbean area, and as a matter of fact there's only a handful of them, but they could fly out if the situation ever demanded it, unlike the flightless cormorant. There is another creature that finds these lava tubes and crevices in the rock to be extremely useful, and that is the fur seal. First of all, the fur seal is actually a sea lion rather than a seal, and the way you can tell the difference is because sea lions use their shoulders and arms more, and seals use their tails to swim by. During the day, the fur seals tend to hide out in the old lava tubes. Frequently these lava tubes are connected to the ocean, and there is ocean salt water in them, and that salt water fluctuates according to the waves and the tides. Like the penguin, the fur seals came up from the Antarctic. They followed the Humboldt Current along South America and ended up at the Galapagos. There's plenty of food here for them. The cold currents take care of that, but during the day they suffer. The equator is simply no place for an animal with a double-layered fur coat. But in addition, that double-layered fur coat made it very huntable, and they were hunted to what was thought to be extinction in the 1930s. But since the animals are nocturnal, not all of them were killed, and they're making a comeback. But fur seals, or if you prefer fur sea lions, aren't the only pinniped in the Galapagos. The more common one is the California sea lion. And this California sea lion has got himself a fish. He's in a mangrove swamp, and he's trying to figure out how to beat that fish into small pieces so that he can swallow it down easily. California sea lions are known to be very playful, not only with themselves, but they also seem to enjoy the company of people. They play with divers quite often and snorkelers. And in the Galapagos, at least, they're reported to steal cameras, underwater cameras, and run off with them. Anything for a joke, you know. Sea lions are almost always part of the welcoming committee on the Galapagos Islands. Baby sea lions are left in nurseries while mom goes out for groceries, and no one has more fun than baby sea lions. You did notice the stick, didn't you? This is very dog-like behavior. I believe you could teach him to play fetch. And when baby wants mom, he cries very much like a human baby. Every day we have to set sail to maintain our schedule. By the way, the movie Master and Commander is based on some real events. The movie is based on the book by that name, but in the book it's not a French frigate, the Acheron, that they're chasing. Instead, it's the War of 1812, and it's an American ship, the Norfolk. Now, the Norfolk is fictitious. The real ship that was sailing in these waters during the War of 1812 was the Essex. And the Essex did substantial damage to the British whaling fleet in the Pacific. Herman Melville had written about the Essex. In fact, he had been a sailor aboard one of the whaling ships in these waters. And it's that experience that helped him to write the book Moby Dick. As we move east of Isabella, the islands become much older, and plants have had time now to break down some of the lava. In the early days of the life of a lava field, the lava field can only support a few types of pioneer plants. Cactus is one of those plants that can survive without a great deal of soil. On many islands where animals eat the cactus, and they do for the water, the cactus have grown quite tall in order to be able to get their cactus plant out of the danger of being eaten by the animals. The needles often point down to discourage animals from climbing up into the cactus, but some needles are soft and not pointed. In those cases, the cactus seems to be actually inviting visitors. The visitors that it's trying to attract apparently are pollinators, something the cactus can't live without. In any event, eventually the pioneers will create enough earth for more normal plants to start taking hold in the old lava fields. And those new plants will start breaking up the lava fields even more. Meanwhile, at the edges of the islands, mangrove swamps are taking hold. Mangrove is important for a couple of different reasons, and the main one is because it's saltwater tolerant. It can live off of the ocean's water. And the result of that is that it has a constant, steady supply of nutrients. In addition, because the mangroves grow into the ocean, they create a tangle of vegetation that is an ideal location for a large number of fishes and other animals to survive, especially when they're quite young and small. We're in the mangrove swamp looking for animals, specifically sea turtles. They like to come into these mangroves, especially at night, to sleep, and we're expecting to see a few of them. There's one now. Unlike the sea lions, the sea turtles don't come out and greet you and try to play. But the good news is that although they're not seeking you out, they're at least not avoiding people either. They don't seem to be terribly afraid of people. Sea turtles can get to be quite large, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. These turtles are much smaller than that, and it's probably partly for that reason that they're seeking the protection of the mangroves. They may not be large enough to survive easily out in the open ocean at night. After all, sea turtles do sleep, and like mammals, they do have to breathe. These turtles are coming up for air every few minutes. It would be complicated for sea turtles to be sitting on the ocean floor and trying to come up for air every few minutes that way. And there are two reasons why that's not a problem. One is when the turtles go to sleep, they can extend the amount of time that it takes for them to come up for air, but they still have to come up for air periodically. The water here in the mangroves is especially shallow, so they only have to come up a few feet in order to gulp down some air here. That makes this a very convenient place for them to stop over and take a nap. One of the common types of sea turtles is the green sea turtle. It's not actually green in color, at least when you look at it from the outside. You have to open it up in order to see the fat, in order to see the green. The green sea turtle feeds on algae, and the algae makes its fat green in color. And seen as though they were good eating, and people were familiar with the turtle's fat, that's exactly how they got their name. These days, of course, sea turtles are off the menu in the Galapagos. If we're quiet, we're hoping to see more and more sea turtles, and in fact, from time to time, they do appear. This sea turtle actually looks dead, but that's not the case. It's really only asleep. Well, it's time to go back on board the ship so that we can keep up with our schedule. We're going to an island now almost entirely dominated by birds. It's North Seymour. It's just north of Baltra. In fact, Baltra's alternate name is South Seymour. This particular island is the reason why we're going to the Galapagos when we did in May. And the reason is because it's courting time among the birds that are on these islands. This is the time of year when the currents tend to change their dominance. The colder currents become more dominant and the warmer currents become less dominant. And that means there's going to be more seafood. And these birds depend on seafood. This bird is called a blue-footed booby. It's easy to see why it's called blue-footed, but what about booby? Well, it turns out that this is an old word, an old Spanish word, that means something like clown. And this bird does clown around a great deal, especially during courting season. Its courting behavior is quite comical. But another thing to keep in mind is this bird has no fear of people. And so this bird was also very foolish in that it allowed people to get close to them and kill them. The blue-footed boobies make two different kinds of sounds. The male does a whistling sound, and the female does a honking sound. Both of them will do a sort of dance that shows off those blue feet, because the blue feet indicates the health of the birds. That's the male's whistle. Notice that she honks, and he spreads his wings and takes a pose which is called sky pointing. I believe she's standing on that rock because it makes her blue feet more obvious. And of course he's strutting his blue feet so that she can't possibly miss it. This basically says, I'm the bird for you. That behavior is called bill fencing. Since this is the kind of behavior I came here to video, I'm going to be staying here just a little while longer than I would normally. Uh-oh, we've got another male that's trying to horn in on the action. Well, that's certainly not going to be tolerated. Well, it looks like that interloper has been seen off. Now it seems that the interloper is having absolutely no luck getting his own girl. Meanwhile, the pair of birds are doing some symbolic nest building, gathering up sticks and showing it to each other. The courtship goes on like this pretty much indefinitely. But of course at some point it does have to stop and the nest building has to begin. Now take a bow and we'll move on. The next bird that we're going to see, actually we saw quite a few of them, was a mockingbird. But this particular mockingbird was doing something unusual. If you look closely, you'll see that it's after something. The insect that it's after is a scorpion, and the bird is snipping off the stinger. Now that the stinger is gone, he's beating the scorpion into unconsciousness, and he's going to eat it. It's 1 for the mockingbird, 0 for the scorpion. For the scorpion, this is the end. We're going up now to Tower Rock, which is also known as Hinovisa. Hinovisa is the only island in the Galapagos that is routinely visited by tourists and is also above the equator. It's actually in the North Pacific instead of the South Pacific. Hinovisa is also one of those islands that is dominated by birds. In fact, those are practically the only residents, and the way those birds make a living is by fishing. We're here to see 3 species of birds in particular. 2 of them are boovies, and then there is the frigate bird. The frigate bird is often seen flying around these areas on patrol, and what he's looking for is he is looking for other birds that have been fishing successfully, because the frigate bird is a pirate. The frigate bird steals from the two other species that we're looking at, both of which are boobies. This happens to be the red-footed booby. The blue-footed booby, which we saw earlier, likes to fish in shallower waters. The red-footed booby and the Nazca or mast booby prefer to fish in deeper waters, and so they don't usually nest in the same locations. Notice that the red-footed booby feet are not fully webbed, and the result of that is they can spend a great deal of time perching in trees and shrubs. This is not true of the other two boobies. They tend to stay on the ground. They tend to be more fully webbed. In contrast to the red-footed booby, the mask booby or Nazca booby, it goes by both names, and Nazca is generally preferred now, tends to stay on the ground. And they have a clear breeding cycle, which some of the other boobies do not. And this is the time of year in which they are breeding and raising chicks. As I said earlier, this is the time of year when the dominance of the currents is changing from warm water to cold water, and the cold water currents contain more life. The result is fishing is better, and that means that this is the time of year for the boobies to be raising their chicks because food is plentiful. Notice that Mom is not sitting on the egg, she's shading it. There's a good reason for that. The sun here is very, very warm. Darwin writes that in the shade it was 93 degrees one day, and if he took it outside of the tent in the open air, the temperature was 85 degrees. He put the thermometer down on some brown sand and the temperature immediately rose to 137 degrees, but how warm it actually got he didn't know, because that's as far as the thermometer was going. The black sand felt much hotter. For the frigate birds too, this is breeding season, and so the males are looking for females, and this is a male frigate bird, and this is the way that he attracts females. He has that red sac on his throat. He puffs that up, spreads his wings out, and shakes them a little bit when he sees a female in order to attract her attention. She is flying overhead, and when she sees something she likes, she'll come down and investigate. Frigates were the name that people gave to fast-moving ships, the kind that were fairly heavily armed. And these type of ships were favored by pirates. And so when they started calling the frigate bird a frigate bird, the reason that's given that name is because it's a pirate, and it likes to steal from other birds. Now there are reasons why it has to steal. One is because it cannot dive into the ocean. If it gets into water, chances are it's not getting up and out again. If it does any fishing, it has to do it by skimming along the surface. That's also the way that it drinks water, by skimming above the surface of fresh water and drinking it down. This next bird you wouldn't expect to see at all during the day because it's an owl. Specifically, it's a short-eared owl. And this short-eared owl has just made a kill. But that's also a little bit surprising because usually you think of owls hunting rodents. In this particular case, the prey was another bird, specifically a storm petrel, which is a small diving bird. So why this odd event? Well, for one thing, on this particular island, there aren't very many other things other than birds for the owl to hunt. And there are no hawks. There is a Galapagos hawk we'll be seeing later, but on this particular island, there is no Galapagos hawk. And so the owl has started taking over the hawk's niche, and it's hunting during the daytime. And since there's not much to eat on this island other than other birds, that's what the owl is hunting. But these other birds are far more agile than the owl. They're able to get around and couldn't possibly be caught in flight by the owl. So the owl has to ambush them when they're coming in or going out of their nests. It'll sit and wait until one of the birds starts to take off or starts to land, and then when that happens, the owl will pounce on it out of hiding and catch it before it can get any flight speed up. The behavior that you're seeing now is called mantling, and that is where the predator, usually a raptor of some kind, holds its wings over the prey. And the reason that it's doing that is to keep other birds from seeing that it has caught something. This behavior is unique. The fact of the matter is that this owl exists on other islands. And on other islands, its behavior is more like that of an owl. It hunts at night, and it hunts smaller rodents or lizards or something, but usually not birds. So this is really quite different. My tour group was with me when we ran onto the owl. And the owl refused to eat while the tour group was standing around. But the moment that they left and went a few feet away, they did start to feed again. And so this is film footage that is really fairly rare. Tower Rock, which is where we are, also called Genovesa or Hinavisa, is a large platform well above sea level. And in order to get to it, you have to go up very steep cliffs, except for one particular point. And we're going down what's called Prince Philip's Steps, and it is named after the British Prince Philip. This is where he ascended this particular area some years ago from the ship Britannica, the roiled yacht. For the most part, when we travel from island to island, we travel at night, leaving the day available for excursions onto the various locations. We're returning to the island of Santa Cruz, which is also called Indefatigable, after a British warship by that name.
I've been reading from Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. It's not really a diary of his voyage. It was written actually after the voyage is over, but it does recount the entire 5 years. Now, we're in the Galapagos, and so the part of the Voyage of the Beagle that we're most interested in is the one chapter that has to do with the Galapagos. Of that 5-year voyage, Charles Darwin was only in the Galapagos for about 6 weeks.
Most of the animals that we've already seen, Charles Darwin does not note in Voyage of the Beagle. This is probably because some of them he never met, and some of them were probably too common for him to note. This is a lava lizard. This is a common enough animal on any of the islands for that matter. And they come in both male and female. The first one we saw was male. We know that because it had stripes. This is a female. It's got more reddish color. But an interesting question arises. How did these reptiles get to the Galapagos, and why are they so common? Well, like the cactus, reptiles tend to like hot, dry places. They're survivors. And so they tend to be pioneers on these kind of lava rocks. But of course, that doesn't answer how they got here. How they got here appears to have been from South America. And the only thing that makes sense, really, is that they got here on a raft of vegetation, and then they began to thrive on the island. They eat mostly insects, and there are plenty of those around. Darwin was only aware of one mammal, a mouse, on the Galapagos Islands. Nowadays we know that there are a couple of bats as well. Nevertheless, mammals are quite scarce. Lava lizards make quite good neighbors if you happen to be a giant tortoise, or for that matter a seal, because the lava lizards tend to eat up insects and parasites, and they can be very helpful for the larger animals. That way they can't reach into all the little crevices where those parasites might possibly be. By the way, that mouse that I told you about that Darwin knew, he hadn't discovered that mouse himself. Instead, Darwin's normal procedure was not to go out and look for animals himself quite so much as it was to depend on locals who were already there to tell him what was in the locality. In this case, there was a Mr. Waterhouse that told him about the mouse. But as I said, lava lizards were small fry to Charles Darwin. He was looking for bigger things, and he found them. There are two types of iguana in the Galapagos. They are related to the type of iguana that there is in South America. They are all vegetarians. One of the two types of iguana is the land iguana. The land iguana makes burrows, rather large burrows in the soil, and some of those holes do not appear to be very deep, or at least they didn't to Charles Darwin. They enter the ground, he says, at a small angle, so that when walking over these lizard warrens, the soil is constantly giving way, much to the annoyance of the tired walker, he says. This animal, when making its burrow, works alternately the opposite sides of its body. One front leg for a short time scratches up the soil and throws it towards the hind foot, which is well placed so as to heave it beyond the mouth of the hole. That side of the body getting tired, the other takes up the task, so on alternately. I watched one for a long time, till half his body was buried. I then walked up and pulled it by the tail. At this it was greatly astonished, and soon shuffled up to see what was the matter, and then stared at me in the face, as much as to say, "What made you pull my tail?" And how did this iguana get to the Galapagos? Well, like the lava lizard, it must have come on a raft of vegetation. Like the lava lizard, it doesn't need much food or water to make the trek. And lizards can generally go torpid when they have to. They can go into a type of hibernation. Some reptiles can go for as long as a year without food or water. By the way, during World War II, U.S. servicemen used land iguanas for target practice on the island of Baltra. The other type of iguana is a marine iguana, and Galapagos is the only place where you can find a marine iguana. The marine iguana and the land iguana are very closely related. As a matter of fact, they can hybridize, but their offspring, like a mule, is sterile. Darwin learned about this animal from a Mr. Bell. The usual length of the animal is about a yard, but it could be as much as 4 feet long and weighing about 20 pounds. They're occasionally seen in hundreds along the shore, or thousands, swimming about. The locals told Darwin that the marine iguanas ate fish. Darwin perhaps doubted this, though, and he opened up the stomachs of several, and he found in them large amounts of minced seaweed. He didn't find any evidence of fish at all, and he concluded that they were eating the algae on the ocean floor. Then Darwin conducted an odd little experiment. He tried to see if he could drive the lizards down into the sea. He says that when the marine iguana is frightened, it will not enter the water. Hence, it is easy to drive these lizards down to any little point overhanging the sea, where they will sooner allow a person to catch hold of their tails than to jump into the water. They do not seem to have any notion of biting. Darwin writes, "I threw one several times as far as I could into the deep pool, left by the retiring tide, but it invariably returned in a direct line to the spot where I stood. It swam near the bottom with a very graceful and rapid movement, and occasionally aided itself over the uneven ground with its feet. As soon as it arrived near the edge, but still being underwater, it tried to conceal itself in the tufts of seaweed, or it entered some crevasse. As soon as it thought the danger was past, it crawled out on the dry rocks and shuffled away as quickly as it could. I several times caught this same lizard, and though possessed of perfect powers of diving and swimming, nothing would induce it to enter the water, and as before, I threw it in. It returned in the manner described above. Now, why would a lizard behave this way? Well, lizards are cold-blooded animals, and as a result of that, they lose their temperature very rapidly when they go in swimming. In 30 minutes, it's possible that a large iguana will have to come out of the water or face death. From the iguana's point of view, all of the dangers are in the ocean, and there are no predators on land, so the land is quite safe. So why go swimming at all? Well, my guess is that these iguanas found themselves at some time in the past in a situation where there was nothing to eat except for the algae on the seashore, and that was depleted pretty rapidly. And in order to find algae that was still edible, they had to start swimming. It was swim or starve. The result is the only lizard that exists entirely on marine vegetable products. When you see the marine iguanas sleeping on rocks, very frequently you'll hear one of them sneeze. And that is because they do go into salt water and their bodies are not designed for that. And what they're doing is they're sneezing out the salt. The big males can dive as much as 50 feet and stay out for half an hour. There are some 300,000 marine iguanas in the Galapagos. But one of Darwin's greatest discoveries, and for that matter, one of his greatest failures, was the finches in the Galapagos. There are 14 species of finches in the Galapagos. They do a wide variety of things. One is kind of like a woodpecker, although in order to perform the duties of a woodpecker, it has to borrow a cactus spine in order to get out the grubs. Another is a type of vampire. But all of these finches came from one type of finch, which came to the Galapagos from South America. Darwin misidentified over half of the species of finches on the Galapagos. It was only after Darwin returned to England that ornithologist John Gould set him straight and showed that all those birds were finches. And with the exception of the cactus finch and the warbler finch, Darwin actually failed to observe any difference in diet among the various species. He believed that food consumption of all of these birds was essentially identical, and for that reason he could never argue in his book Origin that different beaks were necessarily adaptive and hence produced by natural selection. Ornithologists continued to discount the adaptive nature of the beak differences in Darwin's finches for nearly a century. However, those beak differences are critical. Some of the beaks are very strong for very particular eating habits. Others are very delicate or very short or very long for different kinds of food. Since the food is different on each island, the birds have to be different on each island. That is, they have to have different equipment to handle life's problems. Darwin didn't realize that when he was in the Galapagos, and when he collected his specimens, he did not indicate which islands they had to come from. Take a look at this guy's beak. It's very robust. When John Gould pointed out the importance of the beak to Darwin, and the fact that Darwin hadn't labeled what island his birds came from, he had to go back to other people on the crew that also had collections, including Fitzroy, Fitzroy Stewart, and his own servant. These three shipmates had all labeled their collections in more detail and more correctly than Darwin had. As a consequence, Darwin never relied on the finches as part of his argument for evolution. Instead, he gives the Galapagos only about the same amount of space as he gives to the Madeiras Islands, New Zealand, or Tahiti. I have just one more bird story that I'd like to tell, and that has to do with the Galapagos hawk. The Galapagos hawk is the top predator in all of the Galapagos. This hawk happens to be a juvenile Galapagos hawk. Like every other visitor to the Galapagos, Charles Darwin was impressed by the tameness of all the animals. He writes, "I will conclude my description of the natural history of these islands by giving an account of the extreme tameness of the birds. This description is common to all the terrestrial species, namely to the mocking thrushes, the finches, wrens, tyrant flycatchers, the dove, and the carrion buzzard. All of them are often approached sufficiently near to be killed with a switch, and sometimes, as I myself have tried, with a cap or hat. A gun here is almost superfluous, for with the muzzle I pushed a hawk off of the branch of a tree." In another place, Darwin also notes that the animals in his time were not quite as tame as they were in earlier times. Nevertheless, the change, the fear of the new predator, man, has been very slow to come to the Galapagos. I'm moving on to tortoises now, but I want to get some terms defined. The terms turtle, tortoise, and terrapin are often used interchangeably and depend on which country you're in. For most Americans, the term turtle describes something that's aquatic or semi-aquatic. The term tortoise describes something that depends primarily on the land. A terrapin can describe something that is in freshwater or saltwater turtles, but it's not often used. If you were in Australia, you might call all of the turtles tortoises, and in Britain, a turtle could mean a saltwater species, and a terrapin would be a freshwater species. Are you confused yet? So am I. For as far as the giant tortoise is concerned, originally there were probably 14 or 15 distinct subspecies. The problem here was that ships were carrying them away for food. The tortoises would live as long as a year without either food or water, and they could provide sustenance for the crew for a very long period of time. In the past, a single ship might carry away as many as 600 giant tortoises. The result was that over a period of years, maybe 200,000 tortoises have been taken from the islands. As a direct result, 3 or 4 of these subspecies are now extinct. Nicholas O. Lawson, an Englishman and vice governor of the islands, told Darwin that the tortoises differed from the different islands, and that he could with certainty tell from which islands any one was brought. Darwin later asserted, "I did not for some time pay sufficient attention to this statement, and I had already partially mingled together the collections from 2 of the islands. I never dreamed that islands about 50 or 60 miles apart, and most of them within sight of each other, formed of precisely the same rocks, placed under a quite similar climate, rising to nearly equal height, would have been differently tinted. The shape of the shells of tortoises in particular can be quite different. This is a domed tortoise. It has a low shell, and it tends to be on lush islands. This is also the largest of the tortoises. The maximum size for any of the tortoises is about 880 pounds, but a large tortoise may yet be 500 pounds and 5 feet across. Saddleback tortoises tend to have long legs, and their shell is very high, especially in the front. This allows the head and neck to go up much higher than the dome tortoise can reach. And the reason for that is because they're on dry islands, and they need to be able to reach up as high as they possibly can to get vegetation. You remember those cactus that tend to grow into something that looks something like a tree to get it out of the reach of the tortoise. Well, this is the tortoise's response, the saddleback shell. Now, what Darwin did not go on to elaborate on was the reasons for what led him initially to disregard the vice governor's comments. You see, the key to Darwin's oversight lies in the specific name, Testudo indicus, and that was the name by which the Galapagos tortoise was known in Darwin's day. In the 1830s, there were two different species of giant land tortoise. One was now known to have come from some islands in the Indian Ocean. The other one was from the Galapagos, and they had been confused under the same name. This error in semantics in turn encouraged the mistaken belief that the Galapagos form of the giant tortoise was not actually native to those islands, but had been transported there by buccaneers and earlier by ocean-going peoples of the Pacific Islands. Captain Robert Fitzroy reiterated this view in his own published account of the Beagle voyage. Transporting animals and leaving them on islands was a common practice in the 17th and 18th century. That's how many islands got goats, pigs, cattle, or other livestock. And the intent there was for the sailors to be able to come back to those islands at some time and find fresh meat. In his journal, Captain Fitzroy emphasized that virtually no animal was more suited for extensive oceanic transport, since the giant land tortoise was easily caught and good to eat, and required little food or water for long periods. Fitzroy also cited the views of the buccaneer William Dampier, who claimed to have seen another variety of this species in Madagascar and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. Like Dampier, Fitzroy had no doubt that the Galapagos form of the tortoise was merely a variety of this other type of tortoise, the Indian tortoise, and slightly altered by removal from its old environment to a new one. Therefore, it was this widespread confusion regarding the original habitat of the Galapagos tortoise that apparently caused Darwin, like Fitzroy, to dismiss the reported island differences as a phenomenon readily explained. And there's something else that's quite confusing. Darwin, as I've already told you, said that the islands were quite similar. But he was fully aware at the time of his visit to those islands that they varied considerably in size, height, terrain, availability of fresh water, and degree of vegetation. As you've probably already noticed, the giant tortoise likes to eat something that looks kind of like an apple. It's the fruit of a manzanella tree. Those apples are poisonous to humans, but the tortoises love them. Another thing that they love is mud. It helps to control the parasites that tend to get onto the skin of the tortoises. In any event, with ships carting off the tortoises and the local people eating them on a regular basis, the population, not surprisingly, declined. There is another reason why it declined, and that is those animals that the mariners had been dropping off, like goats and such. They started eating a lot of the vegetation that the tortoises were eating. Anyway, the result was that in the 1970s, these animals were getting to have numbers that were down in the thousands. The population might have dropped to as low as 5,000 for all of the Galapagos Islands, but today there are 5,000 giant tortoises just on a single volcano in Isabella, and there may be 15,000 tortoises in all of the Galapagos. So why this big turnaround? Well, when the Galapagos were declared to be a national park, the local folks were told to stop eating the tortoises. Now that came as something of a shock. Another thing that happened was they started eradicating the goats and other things that were competing with the tortoises, and they've been fairly successful at that. But I think a major impact on the population came from a breeding program that was started by the Darwin Research Center in the Galapagos. The research center collected up 6 different species of endangered tortoise and have been raising them at their station. In addition, because we arrived shortly after the giant tortoise hatching season, we saw a fair number of tiny giant tortoises. Now, the Beagle did take tortoises from the Galapagos, but not for research purposes. The fact is, they loaded 40 of them on board the Beagle. They all came from the same island, so you couldn't have compared the shells even if Darwin had realized that there was a difference. And as they ate them, they threw the shells overboard, and so they were completely lost. But Darwin had picked up 2 baby giant tortoises. Now, the baby giant tortoises do not display the differentiation in shells that the adults do, so you can't tell whether you've got a dome tortoise or whether you've got a saddleback when it's a baby. The 2 little tortoises were named Tom and Harry, which turns out to have been a problem because both of them were female. When it became clear that Harry was a female, her name was changed to Harriet. However, Tom never had her name changed, and she's in the Queensland Museum in Australia now. Both Tom and Harriet were brought to Australia by Lieutenant Wickham, who was later the captain of the Beagle. But he was the first lieutenant under Fitzroy during the second voyage of the Beagle, which is the one that Darwin was on. The tortoises collected by Darwin were all recorded in Fitzroy's journals of the voyage, and Harriet's year of birth was estimated by Scott Thompson to 1830 with an error of 2 years either way. On November 15th, 2005, Harriet celebrated her 175th birthday in the Australia Zoo. Harriet only died on June 23rd, 2006, of heart failure following a short illness. Harriet was said to be good-natured. She loved the attention of humans and enjoyed it when people patted her. Harriet spent the majority of her day napping at her home pond. Her favorite food was hibiscus flowers. You'd think that it'd make Harriet the oldest known tortoise, but it's not. The oldest known tortoise is Adawatia. He died also in 2006 and was a pet of General Robert Clive of the British East India Company, dying at the age of 255. This is Lonesome George. He's the only known tortoise from the Isle of Pinta, and they've been looking for a female to mate him with for some time, and they haven't been able to find any. Now they found 2 related tortoises, female tortoises, and they've put them in the pen with him, and they've been hoping to get offspring, but so far no luck. A couple of years ago, both of the female tortoises did start laying eggs, but the eggs turned out not to be fertile. What they have been doing is looking in all of the zoos all around the world to see if they could possibly find a female Pinta tortoise, but so far there's been no luck. And hopes are beginning to fade that that's ever going to happen. By the way, Darwin notes that you can tell a male tortoise by the length of its tail, as you can with Lonesome George. He also says that the tortoises are very fond of drinking large quantities of water, and that when the tortoises are purposely moving towards some place, usually water, they travel by both day and night. Darwin also notes that the old ones seem to die from accidents, as in falling down cliffs and things like that. They very seldom found one dead without some obvious cause. And he also noted that the animals seemed to be rather deaf. He would frequently be following them, and as he passed one of the tortoises, they would be surprised, and they would put their head in their shell and hiss at him. He also got on their backs and rode them a little bit by tapping a stick on the back of their shell. He could get them to move forward, although I take it that wasn't a terribly comfortable thing. Lonesome George, as you can see, is a saddleback, and he has that traditional saddleback shape on the shell and can reach up quite high. Galapagos, incidentally, means saddle. It's an old Spanish word, and the tortoises were named Galapagos first, and the islands were named after the tortoises. Recent DNA tests suggest that the giant tortoises on the Galapagos are most closely related to a much smaller tortoise on the mainland of South America. This would suggest that, like the other animals, the giant tortoises came over on some kind of a raft of vegetation. After all, they can go for a year without food or water, and so that's quite possible for them to do. You know, there may be another way, other than looking in zoos around the world, to find a female Pinta tortoise for Lonesome George. This year, after 150 years of being extinct, they believe they might have found a species of giant tortoise. This giant tortoise was on the island of Isabella, but that's not where it ought to have been. The island of Isabella is where the most giant tortoises are, and this giant tortoise had just gotten mixed into that population, and it disappeared from view. The scientific name of the lost species that was recently found was Elephantopus, meaning elephant's foot. It's closely related to some tortoises that are on Isabella, but this one originally came from Floriana, and those were thought to have been extinct for over 150 years. In 2008, some researchers noticed that some of the local shells were more saddle-shaped than dome-shaped, and they found that these were hybrid offspring from matings of the two species. And they took samples and started tracing down just exactly where the problem was. DNA evidence suggests that those matings occurred less than 15 years ago, and the result is, because of the lifespan of tortoises, that purebred tortoise that was thought to have been extinct may yet be alive. The researchers are interested in restoring those purebred individuals, if any of them still exist, back to the island to which they belong. We're coming up now on a group of tortoises. But what do you call a group of tortoises? What is the correct terminology? Well, I looked up turtles and tortoises, and for turtles it appears to be a bale of turtles. But for tortoises, it's a creep of tortoises. So we've got a creep of tortoises here, creeping along. Seeing as though giant tortoises are one of the things that I came to the Galapagos to see and videotape, I'm going to stay with this creep of tortoises for a few minutes and see what they do. Well, they don't appear to be doing a whole lot, and it's about time for us to get back to the ship anyway. Usually when I go one place or another, it's to see different kind of animals or different cultures or different people. But in this particular case, we're going to the island of Bartholomew, and we're going there for the view. This happens to come from the movie Master and Commander, and it's a beautiful view. But in a second you're going to see something that will give away just exactly where this video was filmed. Look in the lower right hand corner and you can see a pinnacle, a spike. That gives it away. In order to get that view you have to climb a 500-foot mountain at dawn. But this is my footage of the same basic scene. My video was shot slightly later in the morning and at a slightly lower elevation than the video from Master and Commander, but otherwise this is pretty much the same scene. This is Sullivan's Bay. That's James Island in the distance, and we're on Bartholomew. There is that same pinnacle rock that you saw in Master and Commander, showing that this is essentially the same place. Incidentally, one of the things that we were told was we probably wouldn't see any new or interesting animals while we were making the climb. But in fact that turned out not to be entirely true. There was a Galapagos hawk there, and we were told that this was one of a clutch of baby hawks that had been recently born. And apparently the hawks are doing just fine at this particular location. Shortly after he left the Galapagos, Charles Darwin had misgivings about the way that he had put his collection together. He was worried about his finches, and he was worried about the tortoises that he remembered being told about. And so he felt rather bad about it, and when he got to England he didn't feel any better, because experts were going over his collections and they were telling him things that he had no reason to believe at the time that he was collecting them. He misidentified large numbers of specimens. He didn't collect some specimens that he ought to have. Now, after 20 years, he eventually wrote his Origin of the Species. The only reason that he wrote it really was because someone else was about to write essentially the same book, and that person was Alfred Russel Wallace. But we remember Darwin, not Alfred Russel Wallace, and part of the reason for that is because Darwin's book was simply better written. It had more supporting material in it than Russel Wallace's book did. While Charles Darwin was getting all the glory, or opprobrium depending on your point of view, Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, who was only about 5 years older than Darwin, was also doing quite well. He eventually became a member of Parliament, the second governor of New Zealand, and a vice admiral. He established the British Navy's meteorological department. It is said that Queen Victoria would not go out boating without getting his weather forecast first.
Later, when Darwin's book on evolution was finally released, Fitzroy was filled with dismay and with guilt that it was on his boat that Darwin had conceived this theory. It wasn't really good for his nerves. Indeed, at the famous debate in Oxford, where Huxley faced off against Bishop Wilberforce, Fitzroy was there. He was walking up and down the aisles, waving a huge Bible over his head and reportedly shouting, "The book, the book." And just 5 years later, possibly still haunted by his choice of gentleman's companion, he woke one morning, took up his razor, and just like his uncle, slit his own throat.
One final thing. While we were going from island to island, I noticed that there was a research ship that was following us. Turns out this is National Geographic's research ship. And they were sending film crews out into some of the places where we were. They sent a film crew out to film that area that I just showed you about the Pinnacle Rock. And so I decided I'd film the film crew.
You're not filming me, are you?
Yeah,
Don't
actually
film
I
me,
am.
please. Thanks.
I was a little surprised he didn't want to be filmed, but I guess that's the end.